Hi there, Rod Fleming here. Now I've been asked by one of my followers, Rick Santos, hi Rick, to talk about gay men, which is something I don't really usually do, but I am going to because it is interesting and it is relevant to what the other stuff we talk about transgender. And he wanted me to explain or to discuss how comes we have now a perception that gay men are sort of like macho blokes who happen to love other macho blokes. And how did that come about, what it's all about. So in order to explain that, you have to have a look back into history. And the first thing to understand is that that particular manifestation of male homosexuality is very unusual. In the West, it just didn't exist at all prior to the 1950s. And we'll explain why in a moment. But just let's look at history for a while. We have history of homosexual and transsexual behaviours, people, that go back to Sumer, that's 6,000 years ago. More, we have comprehensive descriptions in the Vedas, which are the Hindu texts that upon which Hinduism, the religion, is based. And some of these are 5,000 years old. They were written between 3,500 and 5,000 years ago. So there's a whole range there. Explorers, documentarists, historians have always mentioned this phenomenon, the gay male, right, and also the transsexual ones. They were obviously, homosexuality was well known in Greece. It was well known throughout the Middle East. It was well known in Rome. In Rome, we'll just take the example. In Rome, to be penetrated was the ultimate insult for a man. He lost all of his status the instant he did that. And that kind of conditioned our later attitudes. So we'll come back to that. But that was not the case in Greece. Where homosexuality was accepted in Greece, everybody knew what was going on. You know, and we have things like pot decorations that show men having sex. Anally penetrative sex, right? There's a whole lot of nonsense goes on about intercrural sex and you name it, but let's be quite honest, we know what they were doing. If we come forward in European culture after the Dark Ages, we have the Renaissance, of course. This was in our culture, really was born. And here you find homosexuality had defined itself into two real forms. You had really feminine boys, effeminate you might like to call them, effeminate boys, who were pursued by older men. They were known to hang around street corners and solicit. Michelangelo, famously, was attracted to boys like this, as was Leonardo da Vinci. The painter Caravaggio, I'll put up one of his pictures. He painted a very famous painting of a boy that he had picked up on the street and slept with. And we don't know if it was a relationship that went on or if it was a one-night stand. We just don't know, but a painting like that, I suppose it must have gone on for a little while because, it takes a while to make a painting. So he was shafting this boy rotten for as long as it took, at least. Come forward into the 18th century and looking at, there's two across most European cities, but in London it's really well documented. They had things called the Molly houses, which I've discussed. And these were basically bars that would have been recognised. You would have understood them if you've ever been to a place like Cascades at Nana Plaza in Bangkok. They were basically sex bars, and they would have rooms off them where the act of sex could be consummated. And here again you found there are very good descriptions of girly boys, right, and older effeminate males who were the patrons of these places. And the older effeminate males were called Queenies and things like that. And the girly boys would partner with them. They would actually have marriages and things like that. So you have this, the point to remember is that both expressions of the slightly older males who were the partners of these girly boys were both very feminine, or effeminate if you like. And it seems to have been the case that, certainly in the Molly houses, that what was happening was that young men were playing the role of the girly boys, and as they got older and became less attractive or less feminine looking, because they were not using hormones, less feminine looking, they turned into the queens, right? So they were older. and more masculine, but not really macho masculine. You know what I mean? I was just talking about hormones, by the way. We know that prior to the Romans, and certainly the followers of Cybele, who was a Phrygian goddess, we know they and the Parthians and many others, they actually drank distilled horsemare urine, you know, the distilled urine of pregnant mares, which is still used today as Primorine. That's what Primorine is. It's a dried, distilled mare urine, and it is absolutely packed with estrogen. So, you know, if you go back to the Roman times, then a lot of these boys would have been really what we would call transsexuals. You know, they would have been HSTS. Really, they weren't really boys anymore, because they would have had, of course, they didn't have implants, but they would have had very feminized bodies because of the hormones they were taking, and they would be taking large doses. They didn't have blood tests; they just drank it until your boobs developed. You know, by the 18th century, there's no evidence that that's happening. So, when after a certain stage of life, the boys would masculinize, and they would then take the other role that we found in the molly houses. But they were both expressions very highly feminine. Right. Coming forward again in time to the 19th century, particularly in England, tends to be a little bit more repressive, but actually what they were doing was they were putting everything under the carpet. It's a very English thing to do, by the way. You have Oscar Wilde, who's Irish, but still, he wasn't doing anything that other people weren't doing in London. He was rogering boys, and he got himself in huge trouble because he happened to roger the son of a very, very famously anti-homosexual lord of the land, who brought a ton of crap down on his head, and that's why he went to jail and eventually died, you know, because of that. It was very tragic. But he wasn't alone. And, for example, his good friend Albert Camus, French writer, doing the same thing. And they were famous for going off to Tangiers in Morocco and chasing the little brown boys. I think you know what I mean. So the expression of, and there are still photographs around of Oscar Wilde. He's not exactly masculine. You know, he's not really like the Duke of Wellington or anything like that. You know what I mean? He's a very effeminate guy. And if you come forward to the modern world, I would hold up Stephen Fry as a classic example of exactly the same thing. And if you look at Stephen's recent marriage to a young, beautiful boy, then hey, you know, what are we seeing that's different here? But Stephen is pretty much the exception these days. But so if you look at that whole history, what you see is that homosexuals are very effeminate, right? Throughout that whole history. One of the first serious sex researchers is Magnus Hirschfeld, he's German. He was known as antimagnolia because he was one of these. And the gays that he worked with and tried to help and studied, they all referred to him as antimagnolia because there were things that he could get them, which were useful to them. Now, that contrasts very strongly with what became known in the 1970s as the clone gay scene. And you, if you're older, you'll maybe remember these guys. They all used to have really buff bodies. They would all have mustaches, short cropped hair. They'd be really masculine looking guys, you know. Ooh, seriously, I mean sweaty masculine, you know. And that's kind of become the dominant form. And as these guys have aged, you know, you now get this sort of middle-aged guys with beards bonking each other thing. And the question is, what happened to all the femininity? And that's really what Rick's question is based on, is why was there's this separation? What changed things? Why did these gay men become masculine in the way that they did? When we still have HSTS, we still have homosexual transsexuals, you know? And the homosexual transsexuals share many things in common with feminine gay men. Tend to be small, tend to be light, all that sort of stuff, neotenous and things like that. So there's some question as to is there a crossover? What's going on, you know? And it's certainly the case that, and I've heard this expressed many times by homosexual transsexuals who tried to be gay men for a while. And they'll say, one friend of mine said, look, she transitioned actually in her mid-20s, which is late for an HSTS. And she said, I had tried being a guy for years, you know, because my work required it. The place I lived, it was very difficult to transition. And she said that she just got completely fed up of the fact that what was happening was that the gay scene was lots and lots of women pretending to be men in order to have sex with other women pretending to be men. And so she went, I'll just be a woman. It's going to be a lot easier. And she was a much happier person for it. And many other people have said the same thing since, both in print and privately. And certainly gay men do tend to have a certain angst about them, shall we say. And I think a lot of that is gender dysphoria. They're not really that comfortable being men, but they feel they have to do it. So where did it come about that they actually got this idea that they had to be so masculine? And for that you need another history lesson. All of this comes from the United States, right? Sometimes your ideas are not so great, America. Anyway, during World War II, a really huge amount of American men were mobilised to fight in the wars, both in Europe and the Pacific theatres. Over 2 million men had to be demobilised at the end of the war. And they were all basically demobbed at two places. One at New York on the East Coast and one in California. All right. So these places, you have to understand that these guys had gone into the military and they'd been gay, and they may have come from tiny little towns, you know, where they couldn't possibly express their homosexuality. Maybe they'd get beaten up, you know, they'd maybe get killed, you know. It just wouldn't be possible. They had to hide themselves. But in the army, simply because of the numbers, and the fact there are no women. Now remember, men will screw anything. And if there's no women, a cute boy becomes an awful lot more attractive, even to a straight guy. Don't bother lying to us. So these men, these gay men, had been having a right party to themselves. It's like, oh, great, you know, because they basically had access, as long as they were careful and they didn't get, you know, caught, they had access to as many healthy, fit, young gay bodies as they could possibly want. And now they were being demobbed. What, do you think they're going to go back to No Hopesville, Arizona? You really think that? No, of course not. So what happened was that they gravitated on the west. They were actually mainly demobbed at San Diego, but they went principally to San Francisco, right, on the west coast, and in the east they just stayed in New York. Why go back to, you know, a 5,000 person town where everybody knows your name and, you know, you're the only gay in town and stuff? And I mean, it must be hellish. You know, that must be a terrible existence, and I don't blame them. So they formed communities. Now, at this point, an interesting character called Harry Hay appears. Now, Harry wasn't in the war. He was too old, and he had been a communist activist before the war. Leftist activism is very prevalent in the United States at the moment, but it's not the first time it's appeared. At the time of the Great Depression and through into the 30s, communism was very, very active in the United States, and Harry Hay was one of the leaders. Now, communists don't, at that time anyway, communism really had no liking for homosexuals, and the Communist Party of Russia, or the Soviet Union, for example, the Bolsheviks, famously hated them. You didn't want to be a homosexual in that society, they'd kill you. But Harry Hay was very homosexual. He was a cross-dressing gay man. He actually did get married, but from what we know, it was never consummated. It was a marriage of convenience, which was he entered into in order so that he could fly under the radar. You know, that he would look like an ordinary dude. Here's my wife. You know, and a lot of gay men did that. That was very, very common, that men would get married to women. Obviously, married women those days, no same-sex marriage. And the idea was that they weren't really marrying them because they might have liked them, but it wasn't a sexual thing. The real reason was social, and it was about staying invisible. How can I possibly be gay? Look at my wife. It doesn't matter that they never had sex, you know. You're not going to tell people that. So Harry was instrumental in the inception of an organisation called the Mattachine Society. And the Mattachine Society, the Mattachine actually started up in San Francisco, and it spread all over the United States, such that by the mid-50s, it was everywhere.